Test.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone wants to add to that? What have you learned so far from the series? Maybe you can share. Hikmah? Maybe Shafiqah, anything?
Just one thing that I learned about these thinkers is that they come from different backgrounds. So some of them are lawyers, judges, and they're not sociologically trained. But their observation of society is very impressive. Like, you don't really need, those concepts. You just need to be able to observe your society and to understand how it works.
Hafiz?
There's been a lot of mansplaining about this series. There's no women thinkers, so they're caught now. That's it.
Smart.
We had one session where we spoke about Fasil Ali who wrote a book about liberation of women, and it was of course in the context when women were secluded in public, usually could not participate, not just like hijab in like this physical sense, but like in the sense when women could not do like exist in like public life. So that was a reason that we spoke about women.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think it's also because about like different backgrounds of women. It's also interesting to look at this week's who was a scholar from other stuff. I think it's very interesting because I think even until today we see like scholars or students who go to like Egypt and who study at Al-Azhar, and then we see how vast and how far the intellectual tradition of Al-Azhar has been. And you know, like what are the gaps in like the intellectual tradition today? Like the students who come back from Al-Azhar, like what tracks are they, and like how are they still with like the scholar doing things today, and like do they even know what is this scholar? And it's interesting to look at like why or like how this thing exists.
Sharif?
I think for me, what struck me significantly is the fact that these things that we are discussing are those who help strongly to Islamic tradition. I find it very interesting because, for example, I'm just reading Prof. Maruf's new book where he makes a distinction between tradition and traditionalism. Yeah? So I think it's useful for us to look at these thinkers as those who use tradition to propel more modern or progressive ideas. That is up to me. And I think we will discuss about how these people will back them call Salafis, right? But not as how the Salafis we know nowadays who helps from the traditionalism, which is pretty problematic. But the Salafis who helps from the tradition as a way to go to progressive thinking.
Sorry, I'm late.
No problem. Just can you pass it to him first? Okay, Farhan, anything? I know you missed quite a couple of sessions. You missed quite a couple of sessions.
So, the series that we covered on the interest, I will get to the point in mind. It's always interesting, and even though I've never had a chance to study at Al-Azhar, I mean, every Muslim student here who study sciences will always aspire to go to Al-Azhar, but end up 99% of them don't really study at Al-Azhar. They went there, they really decided. Let's be honest. Really the perceive whereby they are required to attend classes. They don't have an attendance system. So they are busy whatever they do now. So and these are the ones who come back and carry the title that I'm an Azhar graduate, I'm an Azhari. But what they carry with them was nothing from Egypt. Nothing from the scholars somewhere. Probably one or two citations. And these are the ones who we expect, whom we supposedly look up to guide the community in times of progressive, in times of modernity, in times of probably intellectual crisis of faith. So there's a huge disconnect. And probably the only intellectual graduate from Al-Azhar, probably, I'll give credit to Dr. Nationalism, but it's an idiot on its own, because he will be an intellect. Probably the other one will be the most controversial one, Nurdarus, but it's not his fault, I can't be better with it anyway. But other than that, the graduates from Al-Azhar would be even considered thinkers.
Okay.
So this disconnect is something that we should address.
Yeah. So it's about Arab liberal thought and thinkers. Of course, the term liberal has assumed a pejorative meaning today. So we are looking at a period of the late 1800s all the way to early 1920s, 1930s. So during this period is what is known as the awakening period, or the Nada period, where there's a lot of Muslim thinkers who were exploring new ideas, particularly because they are in the worst state of colonialism, and therefore it pushes them to reassess their situation with all the romanticized ideas of the past, of the Muslim glorious past, but now being in the subjugated under colonial rule. So how do Muslims then develop, how do they progress to be on par with the West, but at the same time maintaining their traditions, their authenticity? So that has always been the struggle and the departure from traditional Islam towards a more modern or modernist attempts to reform Islam. So the early reforms were largely driven by the idea that we need to imitate the West. Not blind imitation, but imitate in terms of what has given the West their strength, and that is scientific thinking, rationality, their robust political institutions such as democratic constitutionalism, etc. But at the same time, trying to see within the Muslim societies itself where they have fallen short, where they have become fatalistic, where they have departed from the values promoted by the earlier periods in Islamic history that made the Arabs a great civilization, right? So that has been the contention, and a lot of the reformers actually came from from religious background. So we started off with looking at the Sheikh Rifa' al-Tahtawi, who was sent on a mission to Sorbonne University, and he was impressed by what he saw in Paris and in Western societies. And then we also move on to Muhammad Abdul, who attempted to engage with Islamic tradition through the standpoint of rationality. We look at subsequently many of them are his followers or students, including Qasim Amin, who advocated for reform in or women's emancipation. So there's a few that we looked at. Today we are looking at another figure who happens to also be the student of Abdul. His name is Ali Abdul Al-Raziq, and he is seen as the chief proponent of separation of state and religion, or in short, what we will understand today as secularism. Yeah. Again, the word secularism has assumed a very pejorative meaning in many Muslim societies, but we will look at what happened to the term later on. Yeah. So this is the latest book that I bought from KL just few days ago, but it's a it was written in the 1990s, but it's only recently been translated to English. Aziz Al-Azmi, is it? It's not clear, right? Okay. So Aziz Al-Azmi is a prominent contemporary thinker who mentioned Ali Abdul Raziq as having presented conclusive textual demonstration that there is in the Quran no clear political model. Of course, this is something that today Muslim thinkers who adopted the ideas of a secular state would say, yeah, that in the Quran really there is no political model that is being advocated for. You do find political values or ethical ideas in the Quran on good governance, etc., but not so, there isn't any form of political model, whether it's a caliphate, whether it's a democratic system, whether it's philosopher king, even ideological states like socialism, capitalism, all this is absent, right? So people can read into the Quran whatever political model that they want to adopt. So that's the problem, yeah. So the importance of Ali Abdul Raziq is that he clearly demonstrated that there is no such political model, and that goes against the current thinking at that time, including today is still quite dominant that somehow the Quran advocated for a caliphate. Yeah. So if you look at this is a time period of engagements with his writing, which was written in 1925. But from 1925, the moment it appeared, of course, it caused a lot of controversy, and you find that the book went into disrepute, and people don't really engage with the work anymore, because that was also the period of struggle for independence from colonial rule. There was the rise of fundamentalist Islamist movements to call for an Islamic state, and religious nationalism, and all those kind of things going on. So Ali Abdul Al-Raziq's work, especially after condemnation by Al-Azhar University, went into just disappeared from public. But in 1972, there was an important work by Muhammad Imara, who's an Egyptian scholar, who wrote in Arabic, giving the context of the work of Ali Abdul Raziq. For the first time, telling the public, look, that book was located in a particular context, and therefore the resistance and the opposition to the book has got to do with that political context in which he was operating. So Muhammad Imara's book is very important because it also reproduced the documents of the court. That means the ulama's accusations against him and his responses, so people can actually have a better understanding of what happened in 1925, right? But then that's about it. You find that the European world was not interested at all in the work. It's received only occasional mentions, like either describing him as part of a follow-up to a wider study on Muhammad Abdu, who was of course very well known. So people discuss him normally in the context of him being a student of Muhammad Abdu, or cursory mention like Albert Qurani's Arabic taught in the liberal age, which we covered in the introduction of this whole series. And you notice only in 1994 the book was first translated into a European language, and that was French, and it was done by a Tunisian contemporary thinker, Abdul Al-Ansari. And then you find excerpts being translated to English in Charles Kurzman's Liberal Islam, a source book. It's not the entire book, but excerpts from the book that was translated to English. And interestingly, the English translation only appeared in 2012, which was after the translation into Malay. So we in the Malay world. Europeans are not interested at that time. Yeah? You see, and this was actually the translation, and I think it's published by Institute Kajian Dasar, which was linked to Anwar Ibrahim. And the former press secretary of Anwar Ibrahim is this Khalid Jaafar, who was the former press secretary of Anwar Ibrahim, and he has a bit more intellectual slant, and he was pushing for a liberal Malaysian politics. He was part of the Reformasi movement and all that. Yeah. So when he was heading Institute Kajian Dasar, he actually gathered a few of Middle Eastern graduates, and he commissioned them to translate some of these books by liberal thinkers. So this is amongst the first that they produced, which was done by our friend Mustaqim, who's from Jordan, and they also published Muhammad Imara's book that discusses the context. Yeah. So that was, I think, it's a huge contribution, significant contribution to the Malay reading public, and because of this also, it began to emerge that there is a push towards liberal understanding of Islam, and that contestation is carried on till today. So it was only in 2012 that it was translated to English. Yeah, so it's quite.
Is that a woman?
Yeah.
Mariam?
Yeah, Mariam. He's a student of Abdul Ansari. Yeah, who wrote the foreword and to this. Okay, so you can see, even though the book has created significant attention in 1925, it disappeared, and then now people are re-engaging with the work, which also has its own reasons why. So why the late re-engagement? It's got to do with several. Oh no, sorry, the title is wrong. It should not be late re-engagement. Yeah, so why the late re-engagement is because I think generally the Muslim public was not made aware of this work in the current situation. Yeah, it's got to do with the condemnation and denouncement of the book by the Al-Azhar Supreme Council. So people look up to Al-Azhar as the institution, right? So if Al-Azhar say this is sesat, this is heretical, this is wayward, then people just don't want to engage with the book. Remember what happened to the work of the Rihla of Tahtawi? Someone was at the marketplace, and then a stranger said, "Don't buy this book. It talks about, how this person left Islam, eat pork, and all that kind of thing." Which, when you read the book, there's no such thing. Yeah, in fact, it's the very opposite. So a similar attitude by the general public because Al-Azhar has condemned the book, and also Al-Raziq, who was an alim, who was a scholar from Al-Azhar himself. And he was part of the Council of Ulama in Al-Azhar University. He was removed from the position because of the book. Even his title as a Shaykh, as an alim, was also taken away from him, and he was painted as a stooge of the West. Yeah. In fact, amongst the masses, there was also the rumor that he did not really write the book. It was written by some Western agent who then, if he was asked to put his name to it, to that extent, So let's see who is this chap, Ali Abdul Al-Raziq. So he was born in Egypt. Actually, he's from a wealthy and politically active family. His family, especially his father and brother, was actually politically their leaning is liberal. Liberal in the sense of the accepting freedom, constitutionality, etc. As opposed to the Wafat National Party at that time, who was fighting the British, and they wanted to establish an illiberal state, basically. And also, he was. The family was also liberals in the sense that they reject the conservatives who were allied to the monarchy. So they represent a third way of developing politics for Egypt at that time. He himself was educated in traditional Islamic disciplines, and he managed to get a bit of the newly established Egyptian university, and he also for a few months studied politics and economics in Oxford. Just a few months, then after that the war broke out, the First World War, and then he returned. Later, upon his return, he became teacher of Arabic, and he also was appointed as a qadi, or a judge in the religious institution in Alexandria. After he wrote the book, he disappeared because of the attacks on him, but then he managed in the 1940s return back to politics. Then after that, he withdrew completely from public life, and he built a room in a tower to dedicate himself to he doesn't want to talk about intellectual stuff anymore, and just devote to studying. Very sad life. Maybe we'll all end up like that. Now I want to read this, or maybe, yeah, old man. Because we withdraw from intellectual life, so maybe he live a longer life. I don't know, maybe inside the tower he was partying, I don't know what. Okay, I got this short excerpt, maybe who wants to read? Hikmah? I think you read until here. Until the whole page, until the first line. Yeah. And we are recording, so we just hold this.
Right, so this is a tribute to Ali Abd Al-Raziq from his grandson, Amr Hamid. So I am the grandson. It was still dawn outside when the sound of the dawn call to prayer seeped into my ears, waking me to the dawn of Cairo's freezing winter. As a young boy of 9 or 10, it was my daily ritual to jump out of my warm bed in my room on the top floor of the old and noble house that was our family home. I would follow the voice of my grandfather, Ali Abd Al-Raziq, in his steady recitation of the Quran until I arrived at his rooms located on the ground floor. He would acknowledge my greeting with a smiling nod, continuing his recitation of the holy book uninterrupted. Once he had finished his recitation, he would fall into our playful banter of teasing and tickling each other like school children, with my grandfather seeming to magically cross an age gap of 70 years. I would then be seated in a corner and would watch him silently while he paced back and forth between his dressing room and the bath, grooming himself for the Fajr prayer whilst reciting from memory his constant zikr. Half a century later, this image of my grandfather, Sheikh Ali Abd Al-Raziq or Ali Pasha Abd Al-Raziq, remains indelible in my memory. To this day, I have not encountered anyone who prays and prepares for prayer with the singular dedication of my grandfather. It seemed to me that he used to have a sacred daily date with his beloved Allah. I recall Ali Abd Al-Raziq as a man who was gifted with everything, the gift of a true and solid belief, an enlightened mind, wisdom, a warm and generous heart, self-esteem, professional renown and recognition, and perhaps most of all, spiritual richness. However, despite these natural gifts, he was a most humble person. He lived his life preoccupied with his relationship to God. Our traditional daily dinner was not like that of other Cairo families. In the household of Abd Al-Raziq, the table comprised brimming platefuls of stewed vegetables and salads, what my uncles would sarcastically call the daily plate of grass. Occasionally, these might be accompanied by cups of fresh yogurt or cubes of locally made white cheese called karish. The meal would be eaten with local dried bread that was brought in daily from Ali Abd Al-Raziq's native village, Abu Jirj, in Middle Egypt. This is how I remember my grandfather, Ali Abd Al-Raziq, as a kind and loving, deeply devout and religious man.
Yeah. So that's your list of food to prepare.
Except the bread. The bread.
Yeah. So I continue here. When I reflect on his now famous book Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukum, power, I was always amazed that even today, close to a century after its publication, this invaluable essay still incites huge debates and impassioned responses. For me, every word and every phrase of the book are like weapons that confront and unveil the uncompromising religious misconceptions embraced by extremist political groups hiding behind the mantle of religion. These misconceptions have led to great turmoil and irreconcilable political factions almost all over the Arab and Muslim worlds. So the word, and I'm skipping it, the word secular has come to the Arabic lexicon since the turn of the 20th century, bringing with it a host of meanings and interpretations. It was first introduced into Arab debates as the term Daria, which connoted a separation between religion and state. This later evolved to become La Dini, and now meant irreligious or rejection of the world, right? Irreligious and rejection of religion, In present-day circles, secularism is often understood as ilmania, and has become associated with immorality or the lack of ethics. Many contemporary scholars who perhaps have confused various notions and meanings of the idea of secularism have claimed that Abdul Raziq was an advocate of secularism in this most negative sense, meaning that he was amoral. This is certainly not the case. My grandfather argued for the separation of religion from the state, as he clearly states in his essay. He could never have advocated irreligiosity or the slackening of moral values. He was a man of the highest integrity, and he raised us, his family, with great moral uprightness and a deep and true awareness of the importance of the sacred and of belief in God. Should one wish to name or classify his practice of Islam, then we could say that his tariqah or way was that of following the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad in a simple and moderate manner. Perhaps we will even call him a Sufi, although he himself would never have been so bold as to name himself one. So you see the religiousness of this man, right? And you compare that with the huge outroar and rejection of his work and accusations against him. Now, and to understand why, here's a bit of context. You know, ever since the period of the dynasty, with the establishment of the Umayyad dynasty, right? Muslim politics has been in contestations of who has the legitimacy to lay claim to the term Caliph, right? I mean, it started way earlier, ever since the contestations between Muawiyah and Ali, right? So the term Caliph has always been something that could no longer be assumed by a single person who claimed to be the Caliph of the Muslim world as a whole. So because you have different dynasties all in opposition and contestations with each other, and eventually you have the term Caliph become more of an honorary title that is specific to the Caliphate that you are, or the territory that you control, rather than of the entire Muslim world, right? So that has been the term of the Caliphate, or the Caliph, until in 1876, Sultan Abdul Hamid II of the Ottomans wanted to reclaim this title as a Caliph of the entire Muslim world. Why do you think that was so? What made Sultan Abdul Hamid II wanted to use that and want to reassume the position of Caliph of the entire world? Expansion of influence, definitely. Yeah, because correct. Yes. Yeah. So there was a weakening of the Ottoman grip over the territories, right? And then at the same time, it was also at the height of colonialism, and it's a part of mobilization now, and that's the fermentation of this whole idea of the global ummah, right? Before that, the Muslims don't have this imagination of the global ummah, but as a political concept, right? So this was the beginning of wanting to lay claim to be the Caliph. Now at that time also, the British, ever since the fall of the Mughal Empire, has always been interested in manipulating the masses and gaining control over their territories by co-opting those who can actually serve the empire's interests, right? And there was already a fermentation of people who are excited about this whole idea of the Caliph, of the revival of the Caliphate. And the British exploited that and began to promote the collective memory of the glorious Caliphate, a prestige, in order to then eventually select those that are of interest to the empire. And this you can see, for example, the short-lived claim by the Hashemite ruler Sharif Hussein bin Ali to claim legitimacy as a Caliph in Al-Hijaz when the Ottoman were defeated by the British, and for a brief moment, Sharif Hussein bin Ali was actually promised to be the Caliph, right? And he assumed control. You know the Lawrence of Arabia incident, yeah, Ilyas? Yeah. So that's how the British exploited the divisions within and the weakness of the Ottoman lands at that time. And therefore, if we talk about the revival of interest in the Caliphate, the British also had some role in that. But more importantly, in Egypt, King of Egypt Fuad I, when he assumed power in 1922, he also revealed his own interest to be the Caliph of the Ummah. And in 1925, Ali Abd Al-Raziq wrote his book. So he was basically responding to all this fervor for the return of the Caliph and the Caliphate. And everyone is laying claim to it, and he saw through it that this is a political attempt to assume power, and therefore that book must be seen in that context. And writing in Egypt when King Fuad I has ambitious plans to be the Caliph, and here someone wrote to say that there's no such thing as a Caliphate, the separation of state and religion. So you can guess why he became public enemy. And under King Fuad I, it was the first time where Al-Azhar University was fully absorbed into the state system. So whether the ulamas were manipulated by King Fuad in order to denounce the book or not, that's the guess lah. Yeah. Yeah.
I ask a rather basic question. So, what is the benefit of being a Caliph? I mean, is this like the Pope?
I'll cover that in my second. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So this is the statement by Al-Azhar University for the expulsion of Ali Abd Al-Raziq. Yeah. We should actually celebrate on the 12th of August as the day of Islamic secularism. Coming soon. Okay. Suwati Ali has written a good study, which is a very good summary of all the ideas as well as the context and all that. A Religion or the State, this book, yeah, which is available at Wardah. There's only one copy. I think maybe Yaakob went to buy it already. Because I told him and they said, okay, I'm going to get it. He wrote, the importance and danger of Abdul Al-Raziq's book stem not so much from its call for political secularism and the separation of religion and state, which many other thinkers at that time also has been calling for separation, right? But this is because the fact that this call was now coming from a denizen of Al-Azhar, Islam's most venerable institution of learning. The book represented, in the judgment of some critics, the first attempt by an Azharite alim, a scholar, to Islamicize secularism. That is to say, to found a claim that Islam fosters a secularist view of the state and politics on arguments that is based on Islam's authoritative sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas, contending that these sources religion, not state. So din la dawla instead of religion and state, din wa dawla. Right? In current situation, the more dominant idea is that Islam is both religion and state, din wa dawla, which was the clarion call of the Muslim Brotherhood now. Right? Din wa dawla. But here you have an Azharite, you say no, it's din la dawla. Yeah, religion, not state. So that presents a radical departure as well as a danger to attempts to assume power through religious movements. So why revisit the text now and go quickly? Firstly, I think it's an alternative to the idea of the Sharia state that Basam TB talked about through the separation of state and religion. Now, if you look throughout the 20th century, there is a kind of a pendulum swing. With the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, you find that the Muslim world they began to adopt nation-state system, and they have lost this whole. They think that we can no longer revive the Caliphate with the demise of the Ottoman Empire after the First War. And then therefore it appears contestation between two kinds of nationalism now. Religious nationalism, which is represented by people like Hassan al-Banna, who established the Ikhwanul Muslimin, but in Indonesia, the Majlis Syura Muslimin Indonesia, or Masyumi, that is fighting for the Sharia state in Indonesia, or Jamati Islam in the Indian subcontinent, founded by Maududi. So that's one model of establishing a Sharia state, and which we call religious nationalism, as opposed to what is known as secular nationalism, promoted by Muslim leaders like Sukarno, who actually clamped down on Masyumi, or Kamal Atatürk even. It's a various shades like Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, Jamal Abdel Nasser and his pan-Arabism in Egypt. So these two models are in contestations. But what you see is the latter, which is the secular nationalists, assume power instead of the religious nationalists, and they began to clamp down on the religious nationalists, right? And there was also a lot of corruption and despotism by all these leaders like Sukarno, Atatürk, Bourguiba, Nasser. They all equally bad as a colonialist. So that led to a lot of disillusionment, and the development of the state also was arrested because they couldn't get themselves totally out of the global imperial structure. The perceived failures of Western models like socialism and capitalism and continued neo-imperialism. So there was a search for an alternative. So that was the period, which led to the expansion of the Islamist movements, because then they fill in that void and say, okay, all this has failed. You know, your secular nationalists are corrupted and oppressive, dictatorial, etc. So this is the return of the call for return to the Sharia state. For Sunni Islam, it's represented by the idea of the Islamic State, whatever that means. Or for the Shia, is the Wilayatul Faqih. Islam is the solution to all the problems that was faced by Muslim society, and that means that you bring in also the idea that Islam cannot be separated from politics, din wa dawlah. Which the response of the secular nationalists was interesting, because as the rise of religious sentiments, they adopted co-optation. And that's why you see people like Suharto, who toppled Sukarno, right? Actually, there was an attempted coup, and then he emerged as the general who was not killed. So he took over Sukarno. He was initially against the religious nationalists. He clamped down on Masyumi the same way Sukarno did. But in 1990s, with the rise of the Muslim middle class and Muslim grassroots movements, which he needed in order to support his presidency bid, he began to co-opt the Islamists. That was the formation of ICMI, Ikatan Cendekiawan Muslimin Indonesia. It's like the Indonesian version of the Association of Muslim Professionals lah. Actually AMP was inspired by ICMI. By Suharto to bring all the religious intellectuals and thinkers under one roof and support his bid for presidency. And one of those who actually resisted this was Gus Dur, who established a different organization, Forum Demokrasi, or I can't recall what's the exact name, which then managed to mobilize the masses, especially the religious ground, against Suharto. Huh? Sorry, that's internal. Of course, Mahathir also did the same thing. He earlier than Sukarno, he actually co-opted Anwar Ibrahim and those people from Abim. You have Ja'far Nimeri, who was a general in Sudan in 1983, if I'm not mistaken. Also established a Sharia state in order to co-opt the Islamists. You find King Faisal Abdul Aziz also did the same in the 1970s when he co-opted the Muslim Brotherhood and sheltered them in Saudi Arabia when they were under persecution by the Egyptian government. And these co-optations are actually based on their own political survival, as well as the common enemy at that time. So for the Arab monarchs, the common enemy at that time was the pan-Arabism, pan-Arab nationalism, which is socialist in nature, like Jamal Abdel Nasser, etc. So these are the enemies. So the Muslim Brotherhood is a convenient ally to stem that, because they are also under threat by the Egyptian rulers, and communism also was a threat to the monarchies. So therefore, there was an alliance of interest. So all these things were happening, which led to some kind of ideological impasse, which the Islamists were not able to gain power and establish an Islamic state as much as they think that they have it, through their various co-optation with the secular nationalists, etc. So they became more and more desperate, which eventually turned some of them to violence. You find that, for example, the establishment of the militant wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jama'ah Islamiyah, which was responsible for the assassination of Anwar Sadat. You find that later on also in the 1990s with a series of bombings, etc. But still, the Muslims couldn't progress. And that led to a kind of rethinking amongst the Islamists, right? And then they began to explore a new model of collaborating with the enemy, which means collaborating with the secularists. Instead of being in opposition with the secularists, collaborating with the secularists, because you have this national, with the corrupt elites in power, right? You see PAS, for example. It's very clear where from the 1990s onward, they began to say we can actually work with DAP. They were and if you read Syed Hussein Alatas' book Kemana Dengan Islam, his series of essays in Utusan, so there was a very interesting argument by PAS to say why they can now collaborate with DAP. He said, just like Nabi Sulaiman, Solomon, who asked the jinn Afrit to go down and collect the pearl. So that's how we can actually work with the non-Muslims. Which Syed Hussein Alatas, of course, he make fun of this kind of. So there was a very interesting article. Of course, you find the FJP, Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, which is a party for the Muslim Brotherhood. They also work with the secularists in order to topple Hosni Mubarak. You find another party, Rashid Ghannouchi, the same thing, or AKP working with the Gulenists in the initial phase, before eventually Erdogan began to declare the Gulenists as terrorists. So all that collaborating with the enemy became the default model when they couldn't work with the idea of secular state. So there was also the idea of whether they have been co-opted by the elite or they were actually infiltrating and co-opting state instruments. And that's the argument of your friend Nosharil, for at least for Indonesian and Malaysian situation. Whereas other scholars like Julian Chernoff Huang mentioned that actually it's state co-optation rather than the other way. So given all that situation where the Islamists began to dance with secular ideas, people began to see politics for what it is. It's a contestation for power. And you find the public began to then say that we need to actually emancipate religion from the state. So the development from the 1990s onward has been a move back towards rediscovering works like Abdul Al-Raziq, who has talked about the separation of state and religion, because they've seen all the corruption, including with the Islamist parties. Yeah, so there's a good book by Gobat Zadeh on religious secularity. Has the growing consciousness of the need to separate religion from the state. Now, at the same time, the work now represents this general desire for separation of state and religious authority in order to check political corruption of the elites who have hijacked religion for political goals, and religious actors who disregard non-Muslims and other Muslim sects in their pursuit for implementation of a monolithic reductionist form of Islam. You see, for example, in the 1970s and early 1980s, Nur Khalis Majid, which another extremist, has been advocating for secularisasi, which in his mind, secularisasi is different from secularism. Of course, you know, it's problematic the way he distinguished it, but he was trying to say that, look, people are quarreling about whether you want to establish Islamic State or not, whether you want to implement the Sharia or not. All these debates are creating an impasse, it's creating, is distracting people from the development of society. Yeah, so we need to adopt secularisasi in order to develop society. He also advocated for what is known as Islam cultural, where you focus more on the grassroots value formation of the people and not struggle for power to assume power in politics or through politics. He also advocated for this term Islam Madani, which later on Anwar Ibrahim adopted it and pushed it in the Malaysian public. And then later on, it's actually quite similar to what later on Pak Lau, Abdullah Badawi term as Islam Hadari. Yeah? So it has its roots in Chatnor's initial idea on Islam Madani, which is about civilizational development along humanistic goals. Yeah. So given that whole situation, Chatnor felt that it's essential to declare this slogan that has become a clarion call for secularist Indonesians: Islam yes, Islamic Party no. Yeah. Islam yes, Partai Islam no. Which is, he is against sacralization of worldly affairs. That means worldly affairs, leave it to worldly ways of dealing with it. So, and he did just similar to Ali Abdul Raziq. He actually uses a lot of Islamic arguments from Islamic sources. So, like one example is the hadith on, you know, the Prophet advocated for a certain way of growing the plant, the dates, right? And then it doesn't. Huh?
People were asking because what we're doing is we cross-fertilizing the dates. Should we continue to do this? So the Prophet said no. Leave it to nature.
Yeah, you know the affairs of the world better than me. Yeah, so that those kind of arguments. Yeah, but he also wants to uphold the sanctity of religion, because the moment you allow religion to enter into the and political contestation, then it is subjected to all the dirtiness of politics lah. So he wanted to preserve Islam from those kind of corruption. Yeah. And you also found in that period, with the rise of Islamism, you find those who advocated for non-separation, for the separation of religion and politics, continue to develop their scholarship away from public eyes until right now, when people begin to engage with their writings. Arkun, for example, have been developing this whole historical argument that Islam, right from the beginning, is secular. In fact, the call for separation of religion and state was at its strongest point when the Abbasid Caliphs were trying to co-opt the religious, the ulama group into the court and issue all the kinds of hadiths and all things, yeah, in order to bolster their political ambitions. And that's when the ulama began to develop and systematize Islamic disciplines in order to say, you want to be religiously legitimate, you must command these disciplines, rather than, you know, you are seen as coming from the court or from endorsed by the Caliph.
How is that an example of Islamic
because it creates a distinctive sphere between the rulers and the court and the caliph and the religious sphere, which is maintained by the ulama. Right? There was an attempt to actually absorb the ulama being salaried by the court, by the ruling court, but that's when there was rejection of it. So one example would be, remember the case of Imam, was it Ahmad bin Hanbal, yang the Mu'tazila, the Caliph wanted to push for the Mu'tazila idea of the createdness of the Quran. Yeah, Ahmad bin Hanbal, yes. Yeah, and then he rejected, yeah. So that was an example of a failed attempt to actually marry religion and state because of the resistance by the ulama themselves. Huh? Yeah, and then Ghazali mentioned that there is a term, ulama suk, for example, evil ulama who justify whatever the caliph is doing, through religious argument. So these are not true ulama lah. Ahmad Kuru in his recent work also has argued for the reason why the Muslim world began to decay was when you find the marriage between state and religion. So I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of the challenge towards the attempt to separate religion and state comes from the Islamic feminist movements, because they are the most affected by this marriage of state and religion in the policing of women, from their dress to their participation in public life. So Islamic feminism grew and began to push for separation of religion and state, and I think that's their main contribution in developing the kind of secularity that goes up. I don't know how to pronounce his name, has been talking about, and of course, when the Islamists were also were subjected to persecution, they began to also adopt the idea of a secular society, because then they received the same kind of freedom and protection from secular states in the West. Yeah, you look at Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example. Where do they run to? Ilyas. They run away to secular states. Yeah. You look at Zulfikar Sharif. Where did he run to? Australia, right? For all your talks about establishing, caliphate and all that, Iran, these people find the religious freedom protecting them in secular states, right? Okay, so the importance of Al-Raziq's work is also because it challenged Islamist assumptions. By denying the consummateness, perfection, and infallibility of the beginnings of Islam, seeing it as part of the changing worldly history, and removing the utopian characteristics ushered by Islamist movements. So that's important, because he laid bare the fact that there's so much tyranny, corruption in the early Islamic period. So what kind of golden age are we talking about of the Khulafa Rashidun period, when 3 of the caliphs were murdered? And during that period also you find the bloodshed of the Battle of Siffin, which led to the splintering of the Muslim, right? So the second one is, I think, of developing something new through using the same sources with sound understanding of text and tradition, something that modernist Muslims have failed actually, because of their bluff about progress. Remember, when we look at the modernist form of Islam, it's always about trying to rediscover the glorious period in Islamic history. So it represents a kind of either apologia, you are trying to defend Islam in the onslaught of Western accusations. So you're just being defensive about Islam. You don't develop anything actually. And secondly, it's regressive, because you always say, we already have our Muslim scientists, Muslim thinkers of the past and all that. That is the glorious period, we should be like that. So it's a very regressive way of looking at it, and that's the problem in modernist Islam. So here is Ali Abdul Al-Raziq, who laid bare the historical realities of the Muslims in the early period, and saying that you don't have to be utopian about this, nor romanticizing it, but you can actually develop something new, and using the same sources as everyone else, which is the Quran and the traditions. And meanwhile, in Singapore, we have Perga saying this: whatever the form of secularism, whether it be the one which totally rejects the role of religion in society, or one which limits it to just the moral aspects of society, or one with the purpose of eliminating religion from society, or one which accepts religion to secure harmonious living, it is in principle, conflicting with our understanding of religion. Who is that our? Right?
The one who wrote it doesn't quite represent the guys. Who is it? It's Dr. Haidar Hassan.
They don't like you, you don't need to defend them.
Exposing them. And even he is not independent for us. Right?
Well, he might have written that, but this is a book by Perga, so the whole entire leadership is responsible for it. And there was also a period where his brother was also there, Hanan, who is the deputy mufti now. Yeah, and you know they call it moderation in Islam. So it's so problematic. This entire book is so problematic that I don't feel like talking about it now, lah. So I'll just pass it to Suhail now.
You got the pile of
Okay, Suhail will now go into the detailed argument of Ali Abdul Raziq in the text.
I shall attempt to.
I'm sorry to be a bit slow here. I'm so sorry to be a bit slow here. Everybody seems to understand Pagas, but I don't. Right? So I'm not asking for an explanation of the organization, but that last comment. So they, as a group, or certain individuals in the group, they're advocating that they should not be separated.
They are advocating secularism in principle is against Islam.
But
Which means that it's not separation. So, Perga's argument is actually a convenient argument of saying, yes, we don't accept separation of religion and state, but because we are a minority, we have to adapt and contextualize. So what does that mean? It means that if they are in the majority, they will engage. They will be implementing good law.
And you are going to know. And not just majority, but what you imply is that they are forced to. So we want to see ways in which they can be whatever Islamic way they want Islam to say. Even in Singapore.
Yeah.
Okay, so the government has actually allowed that. He said.
But our government doesn't interfere with religion, you see.
No, but Pergas is an NGO. I mean,
It's an NGO.
So it's not part of state. But you see, what year was that? 2004.
4.
Yeah.
That was before the JI. JI was 2005, right?
2005.
Eh, oh.
Really taken back by that. I mean, if a Buddhist organization said that, and said, hey, we're 70% Chinese here. Buddhism is a future to us, and we should all attain enlightenment, and this should be a state religion for me. Most people will fled.
Yeah.
I think part of it is also, I mean, it could be they didn't respond so overtly, so to not,
Maybe they didn't understand it.
or they don't read Perga stuff because, yeah, that's true, lah. Well,
But okay, this is off the record.
but it's on being recorded. No, I mean I meant it seriously.
I'm the only one who makes sense to that.
Oh, censorship ah.
No, I mean there's a reason why he's in RSS.
The Hanif lah.
Yeah. And there's a reason why RSS is full of ustads. Yeah. So there is it's a containment strategy. I disagree with Walid's idea of Walid is saying this is co-optation. I don't think it's co-optation. I think it's containment.
Ah, okay. Alright, shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay, as you can see, my slides are more minimalist.
Last minute, right?
It reflects the depth of thought.
Oops.
Wah,
Okay.
can I? Okay, so it reflects the gap in the depth of knowledge between Imran and I. Okay. Alright, so I mean that's the title of the book lah, although we call it secularism. So Islam and the foundation of political power. So that already gives you a hint to his essay itself, right? He's going down to the very basics of it. This introduction was covered just now, but I'd like to reiterate. Why do you think his grandson says that he has not met anyone who prays and prepares for prayer with as much devotion as his grandfather? Why do you think that is so? Exactly, right? Because the dominant idea is so entrenched that to even suggest it is to make you less of a Muslim, right? Which is why his introduction, if you notice, quite a substantial part goes into the personal aspect of it, right? Which Abdul Al-Raziq, in his entire essay, does not mention anything about his personal. Although you can see his passion in some of the way he rebuts the arguments. Now, the central question he's exploring in this entire essay is this: how should Muslims organize themselves as a community? Simple, right? That's it. I actually like the organization of his book. It's in 3 parts, and each of the 3 there are 3 parts. And you realize that the first and last chapter, same title. And if you're to look at it a bit deeper, you realize that he's deconstructing all the way to the point of prophecy and power. And then after that, he's reconstructing it and coming back to the nature of the Caliphate as it should be, right? The reason the first 2 books are in blue is because that's what I have prepared. The last book is for you to prepare yourself, it's homework. You don't be a bad student, don't anyhow come in and I apologize for that. But also the key parts of it, once you've reached the 6th chapter, after that it's quite clear. Right, so the nature of the Caliphate. Along the way, I'll of course be engaging you all, ask questions and we can explore together. So the Caliphate is the idea, so he starts off by defining what is the Caliphate, right? Now, simply put, it is, linguistically speaking, it defines as someone who's a stand-in, a successor, right? So, in this case, it is who is the Caliph standing in for? The Prophet, essentially, right? The successor to the Prophet. Now, it is commonly, like the word Caliphate has, at his time, the word Imamate. But note this is within the Sunni sense, because the Shiite understanding of Imamate is completely, it's a different thing altogether. He cites Baidawi and Ibn Khaldun as his sources for saying the office of the Caliph actually substitutes the office of the Prophet. So much so, and one of these evidence was Abu Bakr himself, the first Caliph, his successor and best friend apparently, who basically said that, when people say you're the Caliph of God, it's like, no, I'm not. I'm the Caliph. I'm the successor of the Prophet. I represent I'm the follow-up to it. So, traditionally the idea is that, okay, so because you're the successor of the Prophet, you protect our faith, in that sense, and guide us on the right path. So, a Caliph who, first of all, fails to uphold the ideas of the values of the Sharia and of the faith, by default, cease to be a caliph, no matter what the title, right? Which is why the idea of the Caliph, the Al-Rashidun, the first four caliphs, and then after that, Ibn Khaldun considers them just kings, not a caliph. Now, and that's an important point. So, why this distinction? So, Caliphate has two aspects to it, right? The temporal realm, the worldly affairs, your government and, governing and stuff like that. That's like a dime a dozen, right? And then you have the religious aspect of it. Now, what are the sources of the Caliph's powers? Now, the first one is, of course, from God himself, or itself, or herself, whatever you got to be. And essentially, the Quran and the traditions. Yeah? Now, the second one is by consensus. So, it's like how a lot of modernists like to say, we actually had democracy back in the Prophet's time, you all voted. Nonsense, not everyone voted, right? It's just his friends came together and got him. Like, okay, I like you, you go. Right? But basically the idea is consensus. And they designate and confer sovereignty to him. So there is an element here. Now these are two distinctly different sources. One is divinely attributed, and the other one is sort of like almost a social contract kind of thing, where you derive your authority from the people who you are leading. So, what do you think is the dominant view then?
Right now,
at that time when he was writing?
number one.
Number one? Okay. What about now? What do you think it is? Also same, huh? Wow, shit man, it's been 100 years almost. Okay, so now the majority view was dominant among the theologians, and that's why it became the majority view of the community, because that's where they got their guidance from. Now, what is the status of the Caliph? So this is the second chapter of the first book, right? Or the first chapter. Now there are two arguments essentially, or there are two arguments that argue that Caliphate is essential, is necessary. Right? It is not something that you can do without. The first one is that they derive from the fact that Abu Bakr, the first Caliph, was actually, people pushed him forward. Like there was a consensus saying you should be the one succeeding the Prophet now that he has passed away. Right? And after that period, we have always had a Caliph or a Caliph or a leader, right, to sort of act as the Imam and of the Muslim community. So that is taken to be as one of the proofs that it is an essential thing, because it's always been there and it started off from the moment he passed, the Prophet passed.
Actually, Shias say this because Ali was standing to the burial of the Prophet. That's why
Yes,
he wasn't there.
that's an important one. Which is, thanks for bringing that up. Now, it should be noted that this entire essay is a very strictly Sunni perspective, right? I don't know if he has done other works on the Shiites or any of the other branches of Islam, but essentially it's a very Sunni focus. Also because I think the Caliphate at that, the Ottomans were Sunni, so. Right, the second part is another interesting argument for the necessity of the Caliph. He's saying that whatever is essential for the discharge of a duty and obligation, that necessary becomes a duty itself. So whatever that support itself becomes a duty. So for example, for me to practice my faith, I need some guidance, and who best to provide this guidance? The Imam. So it becomes obligatory. It's a duty to have an Imam in that sense, right? And it's not just religiosity, but also the day-to-day affairs, because you're a Muslim, right? And we have the, what do you call that? There are few principles that we have, that since the Prophet's times that we have argued are important to the maintenance of our Muslim life. One of it is they are protection of faith, life, reason, integrity of your lineage, meaning your family, property and honor. So you realize those are more temporal things, more worldly things. So that's where they derive this idea of why the Caliphate is so necessary. So these are theologians' arguments, yeah? Now, Oh,
I think there is one more aspect I'm not sure whether you mentioned was actually was also one of the Crusades experience,
oh, you didn't mention that.
which well after the fall of Granada, 1492, right? So the Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity or they were exiled, and many of them actually ran away to North Africa, right? Together with the Jews. And there was a mufti there, Al-Raziq, who gave a famous fatwa and argued why we need a caliphate is because the Caliph is the one that is able to protect the Muslims and ensure that Muslim practices, essential Muslim practices like prayers and all that are established. Of course, he was responding to the Untitled, right, who were actually talking the Muslim governments, Muslim kingdoms in Andalusia to force Muslims to adopt Christianity, forbid them from practicing Islam and all that. So that whole contestations, I think, shaped the idea of the need for the caliphate. And that also includes in the eastern sphere, the Damascus being the border with the Christian Empire. Byzantine is also similar. Yeah.
So further, actually, like you see that these external factors are also driving a need for a temporal leader, who is also, right? So the two elements have been supported buttresses that way. But of course, Ali Abdul Al-Raziq, him being him, asked, where is your proof, right? From the Quran. He felt that the theologians who make this argument for the Caliphate actually are glossing over things. They're not digging deep enough. So he couldn't find any explicit verses in the Quran or whatever, or the Hadith, where basically saying that you create a political authority or a system of governance. And this is the closest he could find that supporters of that argument would also state, where you obey the Prophet and those set in authority over you. But that verse itself is rather vague. What do you mean authority over you? A lot of people have authority over you, right? I mean, for one, you had your parents, your local imam, the judge, police officer. So it's too general. And note that the idea of the Caliphate, Khalif, is a very specific idea, right? It has the religious authority and temporal authority, both in one. So at least that's what the traditionalists are arguing. So their own evidence doesn't support their conclusion. Now the second point is that yes, so which is not there. The hadiths that they have cited allude to authority and community and allegiance, but without even going into the hadith sciences or discussing about the authenticity of hadith. Even we assume that all the hadiths that they have cited are true and accurate and actually happened, right? And assuming that the meanings of the words are also not in dispute. So it's giving like a carte blanche, okay, fine, I take it as granted that whatever you cited is authentic and true. There is still no clear proof that the institution of the Caliphate is a matter of religious dogma, religious belief, and not, a temporal one. And that's an important point because remember, Caliphate has to have both, your religious and your temporal. The most common argument that you come across and probably is that the Prophet said you have to give allegiance, obey the authorities, right? And well, Raziq counters by saying, well, God tells us to, honor the agreements with the polities. So does that mean we allow or sanction polytheism? Just because you agree to do something doesn't mean you accept and propagate that idea. And he goes on further to argue, are we not commanded by the Sharia to be generous to beggars, considerate to the poor, and kind and compassionate towards them? Would a reasonable person deduce from this that we should make it a point to have poor people and beggars in our midst just to fulfill that duty? So just because we have to obey and argue that we should have a caliphate, does it mean that we have to have it, sanction it? So he made that distinction. Now, what he's saying is that if you to accept the argument that because the Prophet said you have to obey the authority, then you also have to accept all these nonsense arguments. And it's very problematic because it raises all sorts of questions. The book, page... Yeah, it's from the book. Page something. Yeah. All right, so... And he asked a very interesting question, actually. Why is it then in all the 1300 years of history then, now 1400 years of history of Muslim Islamic sciences, studies, what have you, we have made advances in philosophy, medicine, and whatnot. Why is political science as a discipline never developed? We even have the first sociologists, right? Ibn Khaldun. What about the political scientists? Why do we not have political scientists? We had people, when you engage with works of Plato and Aristotle, which the Muslim world did, yet we do not quite touch on government as much. And he puts that as the reason why the Caliphate the idea of it is so underdeveloped. And for him, the answer is quite simple, right? It's that the attraction to the privileges of royal power incites kings to defend their thrones against whatever, blah, 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 blah. All they're saying is that the powers that be do not like it when you ask where their power comes from, right? Now, we are starting to address the question I asked earlier, what is the benefit, what's the power of being a Caliph? Well, besides the worldly power, now you have this divine sanction that you can draw from, right? And almost unquestionable in that sense. Yes.
It wasn't the hadith to begin with, but the Umayyad, they gave a hadith, this is a hadith. The Prophet says so, so it must be us.
So that was legitimizing it. Now, thank you for the addition. I did not know that one. But essentially, even in this argument, he takes that to be true. He doesn't question. He doesn't say, there are laws, we can write about it, but forget it. Even if we take all that to be true, the conclusion doesn't follow. Now, he looks into the history of it, that, historically there has been no caliphate without power and violence. Allegiance and ijma alone, consensus alone, does not hold the caliphate together. The most famous examples are, of course, the fact that, as Imran mentioned, 3 out of the 4 best caliphs, the Caliph Rashidun, were assassinated. And so much so that the first dynasty, Yazid, the representative of what's the guy's name, Muawiyah, that asshole, basically went and killed the Prophet's grandsons, right? Yazid was the one who did it. Well, of course, some would argue that, no, the Caliph didn't actually know Yazid was acting, he was overzealous, blah, 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 what have you, right? But essentially, he's asking, so Abdul Al-Raziq is asking, what consensus, right? The very definition of kingship, of monarchy, of statehood, is intertwined with power and violence, without which you cannot have temporal authority. So even if at times of peace, the reason why your peace is secured is because you have your monopoly on violence. No one else can dare to do it, right? That has been the way historically, and he has found no exceptions. So, which raises very interesting questions, right? This conclusion, because it is, okay, never mind, we go to this. Caliphate without power and violence, it still doesn't solve the question, we as a Muslim community need some sort of government. We need some sort of leadership. Well, that's why he goes back to the idea of the distinction between the Imam and the king, right? The religious, the realm of religiosity and the temporal realm. He goes back to Ibn Khaldun, where he derives that distinction again, reasserting the earlier point, that when the Caliphate ended with the 4th Caliph, and after that it was just kingship. So there is a clear distinction between the temporal and, that is the start of the distinction rather. Now, if you're to say that the Caliphate is essential to being a Muslim community, Well, when the Caliphate ended, according to Ibn Khaldun, and which he agrees, with the four Caliphs, the first four Caliphs, then can we say that the situation, the assassination of Ali and the killings of the Prophet's grandsons, can we say that the situation unhinged the foundation of the faith or compromised the interests of the community in a way which the Caliphate has claimed would have helped prevent? So, if the Caliphate was so necessary to Muslim life, why the hell are we still around? Why are we still able to practice of it? Why are we still here? In fact, it has grown, right? And here's a very emphatic answer to that. By God, no. Would God, who has vowed that this religion should last forever, place its greatness at the mercy of a specific type of government or attach its destiny to a special category of power holders? Would he want the fortunes and misfortunes of the community of the faithful to be subject to the system of the Caliphate or to the will of the Caliphs? God, in his great majesty, is much too determined to ensure the perpetuity of the faith and too merciful to the faithful to inflict such a system on them. So, this is, remember his earlier point that you cannot have any government like Caliphate without violence, and the people on which violence was enacted were some of the best, even according to their own traditions, own arguments, the Sahaba, the Prophet's grandson, so on and so forth. Right? What kind of divine sanctioned rule is there? Which brings us to the second book, Islam and Government. Right? So what he has effectively done is separated the idea of Caliphate from into the two parts, right? The religious aspect and the temporal aspect. Now, one of the strongest arguments that traditionalists have is that, well, the Prophet did have a state. He was leading a community. So if we study how he managed it, we can derive a system of government from it. In fact, that's how they say they got it from. Now, Abdul Al-Raziq has quite a few examples, but this one I felt was the most sums it up. This anecdote, where the third Caliph, Uthman, asked the son of the first Caliph, right, to be a judge, to fulfill the role of a judge. And he said no. So Abu Bakr's son said, no, I don't want to be a judge. And Uthman asked, why are you unwilling to exercise this responsibility, although your father did so regularly? My father, Abdullah answered, was able when faced with complicated cases to consult the Prophet. The Prophet could in turn consult the Archangel Gabriel. But as for me, I do not see to whom I could consult in case I'm faced with difficulties. Now, this is a very interesting anecdote. What can you draw from this? Any ideas? Yes. So the son of the first Caliph. Sorry, second. No. Abu Bakr's son. So Uthman, the third Caliph, or second. Third. So he asked Abdullah, the son of the Umar or Abu Bakr? Sorry, I'm confused. Long story short, he asked the son of a former Caliph. Okay? He basically asked, okay, he asked, your father fulfilled the role. Why don't you accept the role I'm offering to you? Right? And this was his response. What are the things what can you draw about it, about the system of governance at that time?
If I recall the context of you, right, coming to the passing of Umar actually set up a council. The next Caliph. So, this friend of mine and Zahid, not mistaken, were the ones who will facilitate the election process. So, hence Uthman came to Abdullah as to how you need. So, this was part of the interview process to test who are willing. So, jadi sahabat saya our candidate or not be candidate. So, and then this.
Sure.
Yeah. And a bit of context with regards to this is Abdullah ibn Umar himself, I would say he is humble.
He is what?
He's humble. He regrets himself, he knows his own competency or the lack of it. Such that even in the areas of Islamic sciences or jurisprudence, Abdullah ibn Umar is not regarded as a scholar.
Okay.
Even with his studies. So he knew that he lacked the competencies they have at times, because
Right.
to be the Caliph and also the judge.
Okay. Okay. But what did he base his disqualification on over here? The fact that he can't ask the Prophet, he can't ask, like his father could ask the Prophet and the Prophet could ask the angel, right? What he says, essentially, is that during the Prophet's time, there was no systemized approach. Because a law graduate today, right, when they go into the system, they have an entire, like, centuries-long case law, for example. There's a system in place from which you can derive, you can learn from, right? The precedents, so on and so forth. There is an actual system in place. And the fact that he said that, I can't ask the Prophet, it sort of implies that there isn't actually something that has been organized and proceduralized sufficiently.
But it's more than that, because you can make a case that what the Sahabats who had consulted the Prophet during the Prophet's time can actually be precedent for future potential changes to come forward.
Well, precedent is just one aspect of a system.
But I'm saying, I'm thinking that this Abdullah was probably saying, look, if you want to talk about any system of governance, it has already left because the Prophet is no longer around. So
Oh, okay, that's another way to take it, yeah? I didn't think of it that way.
the Prophet is no longer around, full stop.
Full stop.
He was the exception, and there can be no other
More better.
He was the exception to the rule.
And to add on to this point, it should be noted that Abdullah ibn Umar was a literalist.
Okay.
Okay, such that you will find out the hadith that in front of literalism is always referred to Abdullah ibn Umar. Such that he made a point, if the Prophet ever traveled and he will stop by here, just to read, when he traveled to Madinah, he will first to stop by there to read. He won't ask why. So to him, he has a narrow understanding of religion. If the Prophet does it, I will follow. I will follow. I will even ask what's the rationale behind it. So he cannot see the
Which
translation.
adds to his point,
Yes.
basically, right? Which again goes back to Raziq's point, where he's saying, there is no judge, no clear idea of operations and concrete organization,
And he couldn't see.
essentially, right? That he could derive confidence and legitimacy from. Now, so this is his conclusion from studying the time there, where he said, apart from resolution of conflicts and general jurisdiction, now the other functions which we can observe in the most minimal and rudimentary of states, such as the management of finances, blah, 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 lead us confidently to attribute a system of government to the Prophet. So there was no system of governance. Which leads us to the next provocative question: was there even a state during the Prophet's time? Right? Is a community a state? If there's no system of governance, could there have been a state? Or was there a proto-state? Now, he makes this interesting point about the scholars up to his time, to Raziq's time. He said that most historians have exhaustive lists of appointed authorities like judges, governors, etc. But no such list exists about the Prophet's time. What we have are piecemeal, ad hoc roles that are non-continuous. So one day you're a judge, next day you are a military leader. That kind of thing, right? So, which again speaks to the lack of any form of organization, without which there can be no state. Then if there was no state, then how are you going to draw any lessons on how to govern from the Prophet's time?
The Islamists were counter saying that at the time of the Prophet, he was the best man on the earth. So he was the Prophet. He was, we understand how it was at the but it was only after the passing of the Prophet that they realized that these are three separate roles there. Probably, let's go with the flow when the situation happens and do what we do.
Sure. And that is addressed by Raziq later in the thing, right? Now, which goes back to the question which you preempted, what was the exact nature of the Prophet's role? Exactly. Now, without going to the even like deeper breakdown that you did, over here is back to the idea of religious leadership plus temporal leadership, right? Is it both? Is it one? Was the Prophet both messenger and the monarch? both a religious authority and what do you call that, worldly authority. Now, how do you respond to that? To this? Do you think it was both or just one? Huh? Based on chapter 6. But what did you think before that? If not, it's fine. Moving on. There are, I mean, you cannot deny that there were temporal roles that he played. Right? Most prominently, the idea of jihad, armed struggle, deploying armies against those who oppose the Muslim community. Like you said, he was also a commander, the chief of army kind of thing, right? Now,
this thing on my mind right now is one that there's now beginning thing is that there's a difference between the state and the community. So perhaps the way we've been looking at what happened during the Prophet's time was we mixed the two.
That's his argument. That's part of his argument. Right? So, now, it is evident, he says, Raziq says, it's evidence from glance that jihad is neither carried out specifically to rally men to the new faith, nor to make them believe in God or his prophet. Right? Rather, the jihad is launched to reinforce the established power and to extend empire. It's a purely worldly affair. Now, why is that so? Because of these verses from the Quran. There can be no compulsion in religion. If there can be no compulsion in religion, then the wars that he fought was not for the faith. It's not to get people to become Muslims. Right? Again, in another verse from the Quran is that, the Prophet is reminded that you are reminded you're not there to compel people to believe. Right? You're supposed to change their hearts, essentially. Now, that is a very important point, because what they're talking about is persuasion, and you cannot persuade people by force. Right? You cannot change the heart. You can only affect the material conditions, and that's a very worldly thing. Right? Therefore, the jihad, that the calls for war by the Prophet, where he engaged in armed struggle, was not a call to faith, but it was about establishing a state in that sense. And there is a clear distinction between the role of the messenger, the Prophet, and the monarch. So already there's a clear distinction. Now, he acknowledges that to look upon the Prophet's domain like his worldly leadership as something distinct from the religious leadership is quite alien to most of us, right? And represents a point of view which, to his knowledge, has no support in the creed of the Muslims. As far as I can recall, no Muslim treatise makes such an assertion. Nevertheless, the thesis could be argued without incurring blasphemy or heresy. So this is probably why all the caliphs or people in power against him, like you're saying, it's not heresy. And it really undercuts the entire moral and divine authority of the Muslim leaders, right? In fact, even now, you do this, a lot of the self-appointed community leaders in Singapore cannot accept that. Now, to say that the Prophet was both messenger and monarch is to say that he was responsible for both transmitting religious knowledge and implementing it in this world. Now, the strongest argument, proponent of this argument is Ibn Khaldun. And Ibn Khaldun said that the Prophet was simultaneously, Islam was a message, system of legislation, and the implementation of this legislation. It's all three. Islam is total, right? And this is something that Raziq disagrees with on two counts: no authoritative sources, and second point, it contradicts the Prophet's message. How so? Well, if there can be no compulsion in religion, then, like he said earlier, there's no basis to wage jihad to spread the religion. There's a contradiction in these two roles. What's the time now? It's almost 10. Okay. Just no, let me finish. The last part, right? Okay.
This was the part you carried.
Huh?
No time to do that.
This is the part I had no time to do because work ended late. Okay, so now this is chapter 6. Now what he's saying is that to argue that the Prophet is both messenger and monarch raises more questions than answers. Right? Now why is that? I had another slide which got lost. Never mind. Essentially saying that if it is true that a prophet instituted a political regime, or at least set into motion a process leading to such a state of affairs, why should this state, system of governance, remain bereft of the paraphernalia typical of any temporal power? Why did scholars inquiring into this subject fail to identify the governors of this regime? If it was so important, why did he leave a blueprint behind? Right? That's basically it. Why is it not possible to know the procedures for nominations of judges? Why wasn't this codified? Why didn't the prophet speak to his subjects about government and the rules of, consultation? Why did he keep the theologians in doubt about such an important subject as a system of government that he himself had introduced? And that is the crux of his argument, essentially. And say that it was so important, right? Why didn't he, or unless you're saying he died prematurely, then you can't, because then his work is not complete and God is not fulfilled in his promise. So there is a tremendous contradiction in this line of thought. And he's saying that, you know what, that line of argument that traditionalists have just collapses under its own inconsistencies. And he said that, maybe there is an answer and it's a lot simpler, and maybe it's too simple for people to accept. But what he's saying is that now the prophet was not both a messenger and a monarch. He was purely a religious figure. And that is not inconsistent, because most of history, some of our greatest prophets were not kings, right? Jesus, or Isa alayhi salam, Moses. So most of the time, prophets are not like, worldly leaders in that sense. Now, here he makes a very nuanced argument that prophethood has a certain degree of power and authority over people. That you cannot deny. It's not like they have no power. But the conception of this power is different from a worldly sense. Now, this argument that he is purely a religious leadership has the advantage of being both logical and having solid evidence in his favor. So now he's making the case for why the prophet is not a worldly leader. Now, prophethood is a moral mission. He's an apostle of God. And the sacred power and authority of the prophet is greater than any mundane king can have over the people. And because it is divinely sanctioned, it is completely, understandable that he will have skills that allow him to have political leadership in some sense, or have political skills that, guides people. But that is a small aspect of his greater mission. Now, the arguments on why he cannot possibly be a worldly leader. First of all, Prophet Muhammad, our last prophet, is a prophet for all humanity across time. Now, if he was here to be a worldly leader, that is impossible, right? It is possible to unite the world in a certain set of beliefs, but it's impossible to have everyone under one system of governance. Now, so it's logical that, the worldly thing, the material concerns are not his primary role. It's purely being a messenger. And then from pages, I wrote the pages here, page 87 to 88, 89 to 90, he has a whole list of verses. He just writes out a lot, right? On proving this point that, he's here as a religious figure, as a religious leader for all time and all of mankind, and not at all worldly. So the prophet's primary task is being a messenger. No other goal can be entertained, and he cannot use force. Like the primary role he has does not allow him to use force, because you cannot make someone Muslim against their will, and that actually negates of the Caliph, the role of the Caliph, especially the worldly aspect of it. So with that, he demolishes the idea of Islam, like the Caliphate being like both temporal and religious. And in the final 3 chapters, he takes a historical look at it, and then he makes a distinction like, okay, so you have the Arabs, they have their own state, but then there are a lot of Muslims who are non-Arabs, right? They are united within one ummah, but this ummah is a spiritual one. And because the Prophet's mission was a spiritual mission, and therefore there is no political caliphate, which goes completely against what the Ottomans were trying to do at that time, was to, and which is why they were against him. But then there's still one final question. Why did Abu Bakr then accept the role of Caliph? Right? That is like to do that, read the last chapter. No, I'm kidding. So what he did, essentially, what he argued, Al-Raziq argued is that at that point of time, it was quite clear that because the Prophet is the seal of the Prophets, there is no other religious leader to be had in that sense. And because it is a practical matter, and people, because of his character, they took it up and people understood, right? Khalif is a temporal thing, right?
In other words, it was born out of necessity, right?
Exactly, right? And in fact, he goes on to argue, so the people who are actually opposing the caliphs, you cannot say they are apostate on that basis alone, right? You need other bases. You cannot say that just because they did not politically support the caliph makes them apostates. Now, this is an important distinction that applies till today, right? Now, if that is the case, then the factions that you had within the first four caliphs was not a religious faction per se, but a political one, right? And that completely demolishes the entire basis of subsequent dynasties. That's really it, actually.
Thanks for that.
I've seen the light.
Yeah, I see the light. Okay, so maybe it's because of the chapter that I read. I thought you were starting to make a distinction between the prophet in Mecca and the prophet in Medina. And I'm just wondering, because I thought you were kind of making a distinction that those census also becomes truth. Which is really quite scary. The other thing that I observed, which he didn't talk about very much, because he spent time in Oxford, and I thought, well, he would have seen that whole setup in the UK, right? The monarchy. So we're talking what? End of the 19th century, or he was probably there.
First World War.
So,
First World War, before the First World War.
yeah,
Before 1940.
so very, very early 19th century, say before 1910, right? He would have seen that the monarchy would have still been quite strong, right?
Well, he makes references to it, not to the monarchy, but to Western thought.
Yeah, but the Western thought then, that was prevailing, was that these are people who are people of they're like important cultural parts. But there was parliament that was actually running the governance, and you had a clear separation of church and God, church and state. And then there was, there was a whole cultural effect to that. And I just wondered if that, he would have thought about that, he would have been influenced by that. So actually, I guess what I'm saying is actually not so much about his time in England. I was just saying that I thought in chapter 6, he was saying there's the prophet in Mecca and then there's the prophet in Medina. They seem to be two different beings, right? So that's why I said it was a kind of sneak to the other side that, maybe it is he's in agreement with other people. But then he kind of, flipped back to the end and just was a complete separation.
So one perspective to look at it is to bear in mind that back in Mecca, when the Prophet was always recognized as an Ami, the most trustworthy person.
I know.
Right?
That's what I mean.
And so, when the point about the Prophet invited to Medina was initially to mediate the conflicts between the three or clans.
Right.
So, in a way, you can say that the Prophet in Medina was a ruler by necessity. He was the only one who can mediate the clans.
I know that. And that's
and
my point.
And from that, it progressed that since we can only agree that he's the most trustworthy guy, let him be. But the way the Prophet led at the point of that, he knew that he's not a ruler per se. So that's when he formed his own council.
Yeah.
So a lot of political matters were always decided with the council. But he acknowledged that people would only acknowledge whatever decree, whatever policy, only when I see. Okay, so be it. But the consultation was done with the people, with the right people who had some political understandings. So yeah, I would agree with the point that he was there as administrator.
Yeah. So the administrator, in your mind, then what you just said, is not the monarch.
No, definitely not.
Okay. Yeah.
That was a good point.
It's a tribal society. Right?
So we can
governance in Medina, they think that it's a state. It's not a state. There's a term for it. It's called chieftain. It's a tribal chieftain.
Yes.
And it's not similar to what the Persians have,
Yeah.
which is
But
a very
it's-
developed
But you see, it's still governance, though. Governance. What is governance?
That's like saying I'm a class monitor, I'm a governor.
But the monitor.
so the seats.
No. The monitor can actually exercise punishment.
Yeah.
And this is what governance is. There are rules. These are the rules, and everybody's going to follow these rules. If you don't follow these rules, when the teacher comes in, everybody stand, and I mean stand.
Oh, but you see,
Right.
the problem is that the traditionalists, what they do is they derive some divinely sanctioned principle from this act of tribal chieftain, right? So what they are saying is that essentially what Al-Raziq is saying is that you can't collapse his divinely sanctioned property and conflate it with his task as administrator.
So the way I would explain this is that he went to Medina, he became the administrator, right? But he was still a man of God. He was still a messenger. What he did not do was he did not transform himself and made himself more important as the manager rather than the messenger. So he stayed true to his role as a messenger. See, if he, this is probably blasphemous to say, if he were here today, you could ask him, so who did you think you were when you were in the I was there to solve problems. They had a lot of problems. And this is why, okay, so in Christian books, there's some real problematic books. You know, there's Jesus as the CEO. Right? Well, shit, he was never.
It's the same problem. They take certain divine beings and make it
So yeah. So anyway, I thought it was good, and I one thing I learned from this reading class, I really like writings that pull from the Quran. So he's going along, and then all of a sudden all that Quran stuff comes in, or poetry comes in, or something comes in. And I find that style of writing very pleasurable to read, rather than just a whole sea of text.
Let's become Muslim.
Okay, so this is the thing about not being able to be Muslim.
I'm kidding. I can't deal with your rules. I just you're like the Catholics in my mind. I mean,